The summer heat of 1953 settled over Wyoming like a warm blanket, thick and comfortable. Samuel James Hartley sat in his rocking chair on the wide porch of the ranch house, watching the afternoon sun paint long shadows across 5,000 acres of grazing land. At 70 years old, his hands were weathered from a lifetime of work, but his eyes remained sharp, taking in every detail of the empire he had built. Beside him, his grandson Jack fidgeted with a glass of lemonade ice cubes clinking against the sides. The boy was 12, all gangly limbs and questions the way boys that age always were. In the distance, nearly 2,000 head of cattle moved slowly across the green pastures, and beyond them the Rocky Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the cloudless sky. Jack set down his glass and turned to his grandfather with the particular expression children get when something has been bothering them for a while. "Grandpa Sam," the boy said, his voice carrying that uncertain tone of youth. "Billy Henderson at school says I can't have two grandmothers. He says I'm making it up. He called me a liar." Samuel stopped rocking. A small smile played at the corners of his weathered face, and his eyes took on that distant look people get when they're seeing something far away in time rather than space. "Billy Henderson doesn't know the first thing about it," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Let me tell you something, boy. Let me tell you about how I came to have two mothers. One who gave me life and one who gave me everything else." He settled back in his chair, the wood creaking familiar beneath him. The story begins in August of 1883 on a stagecoach running from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Fort Collins, Colorado. I was 2 months old and I was screaming like the world was ending, which for me it nearly was. The sound of the rocking chair faded, replaced by the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wooden wheels on rough frontier roads. The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the road, and inside, grown men were contemplating throwing themselves from the moving vehicle just to escape the noise. It wasn't the heat, though the August sun had turned the enclosed space into something resembling an oven. It wasn't the dust that choked through every crack in the wooden frame, coating everything and everyone in a fine layer of grit. It wasn't even the driver's habit of cursing at the horses in language that would make a saloon keeper blush. It was the baby. The child screamed with the kind of fury that made you question whether infants possess fully formed opinions about frontier life and had decided it wasn't worth the trouble. The sound climbed into your skull and built a permanent residence there, high-pitched and relentless, like someone had given a tiny person all the rage in the world and no words to express it. The baby belonged to the wealthiest man on the coach. Jackson Hartley sat rigid in the best seat available, the one near the front, where the ride was slightly less brutal. His jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. At 34 years old, he stood 6'2" when he bothered to stand with shoulders broad from years of ranch work, and hands scarred from barbed wire and leather, and all the sharp things that came with building an empire on the frontier. His coat was fine wool despite the August heat, his boots polished leather even under the layer of trail dust. Everything about him screamed money and control. Everything except the howling infant pressed against his chest like a very loud, very angry bundle of laundry that had somehow gained sentience and chosen violence. Jackson Hartley owned 4,000 acres of grazing land under the Homestead Act of 1862. He ran 800 head of Hereford cattle. He employed 23 men. He had negotiated water rights with territorial officials who would sooner shoot you than shake your hand. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, the Peacemaker model in .45 caliber, and he knew how to use it. He had built an empire through sheer stubborn will, and he could not make his own child stop crying. The baby, still unnamed, wailed with the determination of someone who had been wronged and intended everyone to know about it. His face was red and blotchy, his fists shaking, his little mouth wide open like he was trying to swallow all the injustice in the world. Jackson had tried the bottle an hour ago. The child had rejected it with the disdain of a man served burnt stew at a fancy restaurant. He tried rocking the kind of gentle motion he'd seen mothers do, though it felt unnatural in his large hands. He tried walking the length of the coach during the last water stop, pacing back and forth, while the other passengers watched with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed annoyance. He tried speaking in low, firm tones, as if the child might respond to reason and authority the way his ranch hands did. Nothing worked. His son screamed like Jackson had personally offended 3 generations of his family, which in a way Jackson supposed he had. "Maybe he's got the colic," offered the man sitting beside him, and The railroad surveyor named Hewitt had been trying to read the same page of a technical manual for the past 40 minutes, his finger stuck on a paragraph about grade calculations and bridge supports. My sister's boy had it something fierce. Jackson didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on his son's red, furious face. He's been fed, changed, the temperature's fine. Well, something's wrong with him. I'm aware. The baby shrieked louder as if to emphasize the point. The sound bounced off the wooden walls of the coach and seemed to multiply, filling every corner, every crack, every space where a man might hope to find peace. Across from Jackson, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face still as water. She wore a plain gray dress that had seen better days, though it was clean and carefully mended. Her bonnet was simple, her posture straight, and everything about her suggested someone who had learned to take up less space in the world, to breathe quieter, to exist without drawing attention. Eleanor Wade was 28 years old, though grief had a way of settling into a person's face and making itself at home there, aging them beyond their years. She had boarded the coach in Cheyenne with a single trunk containing everything she owned. 3 dresses, all practical and dark. Undergarments, a sewing kit, a Bible her mother had given her back in Ohio, and a small wooden box she never opened. The ticket had cost $8, which was most of what she had saved working as a seamstress for the past 6 months in Cheyenne. She was headed to Fort Collins because a cousin there had written saying there was work at a boarding house, and Eleanor had learned that moving forward, even when you didn't particularly want to, was better than standing still and letting the past eat you alive. She tried not to look at the man with the baby. She tried not to think about the sound. She tried to focus on the landscape passing outside the window. Endless grassland, the occasional stand of cottonwoods, the mountains gray and distant on the horizon. But her body betrayed her. Her breast ached. It had been 6 months since she had buried her daughter. 6 months since Martha, born, 3 weeks too early, too small, with lungs that never quite figured out how to work right, had died in her arms on a February morning, so cold the windows had been covered in frost thick as lace. Eleanor had held her and felt the little body go still, and known in that moment what it meant to be emptied out, to have something essential removed from the core of your being, and know it could never be replaced. The milk had come anyway because bodies don't understand loss. They only understand function. Her body hadn't known that there was no longer a child to feed. It had kept producing, kept swelling and aching, kept reminding her every few hours that she had been a mother once. She had done everything the midwife suggested. Tight binding with strips of cloth wound so tight they left marks. Cold compresses that made her gasp. Teas made from herbs that tasted like regret and did little to help. Slowly, painfully, over weeks and then months it had lessened. But it hadn't stopped completely, and now sitting 3 feet from a screaming infant who was clearly starving, her body was responding like a soldier hearing a battle cry. Her breasts tightened hot and full, pressing against the thin fabric of her chemise beneath her dress. She felt the familiar prickle, the beginning of letdown. The biological imperative that didn't care about propriety or circumstance or the fact that this wasn't her child and this wasn't her life. She closed her eyes against the cruelty of it. This wasn't her baby. This wasn't her responsibility. She had no right to feel this pull, this awful biological insistence that she could help, that she was designed for exactly this moment. The baby's cries grew thinner, more desperate. The sound changed from anger to something closer to panic, the cry of a child who had moved past fury into genuine fear. It was the sound of an infant who understood on some primal level that something was terribly wrong. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She had lived through the death of her husband Thomas, kicked by a spooked horse while repairing a stable. She had watched him die, over 2 days internal bleeding. They couldn't stop, couldn't even see. She had been 26 years old and suddenly alone. Then she had discovered she was pregnant. A miracle, she had thought. Something of Thomas to hold on to, something to live for. Martha had been born in the coldest part of winter. The midwife had shaken her head from the start. Too small, too early, lungs too weak. But Eleanor had tried everything. Kept the baby warm, nursed her constantly, prayed until her knees hurt and her voice went hoarse. Martha had lived for 3 weeks, 21 days of hoping against hope. And then one morning in Eleanor's arms, she had simply stopped breathing. Just stopped, as if living had become too much effort and she had decided to rest. The milk had kept coming for weeks after. A cruel reminder, a biological function that didn't understand death. Now 6 months later, Eleanor thought she had healed enough to handle being near a baby. She had been wrong. Across from her, Jackson Hartley stared down at his son with an expression carved from stone and desperation. His wife, Catherine, had died 8 weeks ago, an hour after giving birth. 18 hours of labor. Too much bleeding. The doctor from Greeley had done everything he could, but it hadn't been enough. Catherine had died with her hand going cold in Jackson's, and he had held his newborn son in one arm and his dying wife's hand in the other, and tried to understand how the world could give and take away in the same breath. The baby wailed. Jackson's jaw ached from clenching it. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in weeks. The wet nurse from Cheyenne had been efficient and impersonal, coming daily to feed the baby and leaving again. And yesterday she had sent word that her own child was sick and she couldn't continue, which was how Jackson had ended up on the stagecoach with a screaming infant and a bottle of goat's milk. The child refused to touch, headed to Fort Collins, where his sister lived, hoping she might know someone who could help. The baby's cries became hoarse, desperate, the sound of a child whose small body was running out of energy to protest. Eleanor couldn't stand it anymore. She stood. The coach swayed with her movement. Jackson's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. There was exhaustion there, desperation, the particular helplessness that came from being powerful in every area of your life except the one that mattered most. She moved to stand directly in front of him, gripping the edge of the seat to keep her balance as the coach rocked over the rough road. "He's hungry," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm, the tone of someone stating an undeniable fact. Jackson's jaw tightened. "He's been fed. Not in the way he needs." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The other passengers went still. Even the surveyor, Hewitt, stopped pretending to read his manual. "Mon." Jackson stared at her. Understanding came slowly, followed immediately by something that looked like horror, mixed with desperate hope. "You're a widow," Eleanor said. She kept her voice steady, matter-of-fact, even though her heart was pounding hard enough to make her dizzy. "I lost my daughter 6 months ago. My body hasn't forgotten." The silence in the coach was absolute. Outside, the wheels rattled and the driver cursed and the horses snorted. But inside, no one breathed. Jackson looked down at his screaming son, then back at Eleanor. His hands tightened around the baby, protective, even in this moment of impossible decision. He stopped, started again. His voice was rough, uncertain in a way that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being either of those things. "You would do that for him?" "For him," Eleanor said, "not for you." The distinction felt important. This wasn't about Jackson Hartley and his money and his ranch. This was about a starving infant who didn't deserve to suffer because the adults around him couldn't figure out how to help. Jackson nodded slowly. His eyes searched her face as if looking for doubt or hesitation or some sign that she didn't understand what she was offering. "What do you need?" he asked quietly. Eleanor glanced at the other passengers. The middle-aged woman, Mrs. Porter, was staring with wide eyes. The old man in the corner continued snoring, oblivious to the drama unfolding. The surveyor had gone very still, his manual forgotten in his lap. "Privacy," Eleanor said, "as much as we can manage." There was a small curtain meant for modesty, rarely used, attached to a rod near the rear bench. Jackson reached up with one hand and pulled it across, creating a makeshift partition that blocked them from the view of the other passengers. It was thin fabric, barely adequate, but it was something. Eleanor sat on the bench. Her hands were steady as she began loosening the buttons of her dress bodice, but inside she was shaking. This was madness. This was kindness. This was the most intimate thing she could offer a stranger and the most natural thing in the world. Jackson held the baby, hesitating at the edge of the curtain. "Sir," Eleanor said quietly, "I'm offering, but you have to choose." Jackson looked at his son's red, furious face, at the way the tiny body shook with each scream, at the desperation in every breath. He handed the baby to Eleanor. The child was lighter than Eleanor remembered babies being, or maybe Martha had just been heavier in her memory, weighted with all the love and grief that followed. She adjusted him carefully, supporting his head, the way muscle memory demanded, bringing him close. "Shh," she whispered. "Shh, little one." The baby screamed in her face, furious at the change, confused by the stranger's hands. Eleanor loosened her dress further, unlaced her chemise, and guided the baby toward her breast. He resisted for a moment, angry, disoriented by unfamiliar arms and unfamiliar smells. And then his instincts took over. He latched suddenly, desperately, and began to feed. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. Eleanor gasped softly. The sensation was painful at first. It had been so long and her body had almost forgotten. The pull was sharp, insistent, almost too much. But then the pain eased into something else. Relief. Release. A strange aching rightness that made her throat close with emotion. The baby fed with single-minded intensity, small hands flexing against her skin, little gulping sounds that were the sweetest noise Eleanor had heard in months. She felt tears start hot and unexpected streaming down her face before she could stop them. She hadn't meant to cry. She had intended to be practical about this, clinical even. But her body remembered everything. The weight of a baby in her arms, the pull of nursing, the profound connection of giving life through your own body. She wept silently while behind the curtain she could hear Jackson's sudden breathing, sharp and careful, like a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. The baby's frantic sucking slowed as his immediate hunger was satisfied. His body relaxed against her, going from rigid with desperation to soft with relief. He made a small, satisfied sound, almost a purr, and kept feeding more calmly now. No longer starving, just hungry, just being fed. Eleanor looked down at him. He had dark hair, wispy and soft. His eyes were squeezed shut in concentration. One small hand rested against her skin, fingers splayed. He was beautiful in the particular way all babies were beautiful. Completely ordinary, and also the most precious thing she had held since Martha died. "There you go," she whispered. "There you go, sweet boy. That's better, isn't it?" The baby's hand found her finger and gripped it with surprising strength. Eleanor's heart broke open all over again. This wasn't her child, but in this moment, feeding him, feeling him relax and trust, and finally find peace, she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months. Purpose. Outside the curtain, Jackson stood with his back pressed against the coach wall, hands braced on either side of him like he needed the physical support. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with careful, measured breaths. He had heard the baby's silence. He had heard Eleanor crying, and he felt something massive and terrifying shifting in his chest. Some understanding that he had just allowed a stranger to step into the most intimate space of his family's life. That he would owe her for this in ways he couldn't begin to calculate. That everything had just changed in ways he couldn't control. Mrs. Porter leaned over and whispered, her voice carrying that knowing tone older women used when they saw something the people involved hadn't figured out yet. "That's a good woman you've got there." Jackson opened his eyes. "She's not mine." Mrs. Porter settled back with a small smile. "Give it time." When Eleanor emerged from behind the curtain 15 minutes later, the baby was asleep in her arms. His face was peaceful, milk-drunk, the red blotchiness fading from his cheeks. He breathed quietly, one tiny fist curled against Eleanor's chest. She had buttoned her dress back up, made herself modest again. But there was no hiding what had happened. Everyone in the coach knew. When they stopped at Fort Collins, everyone at the station would know. By tomorrow, it would be gossip in 3 counties. A widow had nursed a cattle baron's child. In frontier society, that meant something. It meant everything. Eleanor didn't look at Jackson as she prepared to hand the baby back. She had done what needed doing. Now she would return to her own life, her own grief, her own plans. But when she tried to pass the child over, the baby's hand tightened on her finger, and Jackson's fingers brushed hers as he took his son. Their eyes met. "Thank you," Jackson said. His voice was rough, unsteady in a way that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being either of those things. Eleanor nodded. She pulled her hand free from the baby's grip gently, carefully, and sat back down in her seat across from him. She looked out the window at the passing landscape and tried to convince herself that this changed nothing, that she could walk away, that her body wasn't already mourning the loss of the weight in her arms. Fort Collins was a town trying very hard to pretend it was civilized. It had a main street with actual boardwalks instead of mud. 3 churches competed for souls on Sunday mornings. 2 schools taught children their letters and numbers. A territorial courthouse stood at the center of town, its wooden structure painted white, as if that would make it more official. and it had enough saloons to suggest that civilization was still very much a work in progress. The population hovered around 2,000 souls, give or take the cowboys who drifted through the prospectors, heading to or from the mountains, and the farmers who came to town once a month for supplies and stayed just long enough to spend their money and nurse their hangovers. The stagecoach arrived at sunset, pulling up to the station in a cloud of dust and rattling wood. The 6 passengers climbed down stiffly, grateful to be on solid ground again, grateful for the journey to be over. Jackson stepped down first, cradling his sleeping son. The baby hadn't made a sound since nursing, sprawled boneless and content against Jackson's chest, like he had finally decided life was tolerable after all. Eleanor climbed down after him, accepting the hand of the station attendant, a grizzled man who smelled of tobacco and horses. She retrieved her single trunk from the boot of the coach and stood on the boardwalk, adjusting her bonnet, preparing to ask directions to the boarding house where her cousin worked. Jackson approached her. She turned. They were formal now, careful. 2 people pretending the intimacy of the stagecoach hadn't happened, pretending they were strangers who had simply shared a journey. "Miss Wade," Jackson said. "Mr. Hartley," and Eleanor replied. Jackson shifted the baby slightly in his arms. The child slept on, oblivious to the adults trying to figure out what came next. "My sister lives here in Fort Collins," Jackson said. "I'm staying with her tonight, but I need to get back to my ranch tomorrow. It's about 15 miles northeast near the Poudre River." Eleanor nodded, unsure why he was telling her this. Behind them, the station was busy with the business of arrival, luggage being unloaded, horses being changed, the driver collecting his pay and heading immediately for the nearest saloon. Jackson's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "He'll need to eat again," Jackson said finally. "In a few hours, probably. And tomorrow. And the day after that." "Yes," Eleanor said carefully. "Babies do tend to require regular feeding." Jackson's eyes met hers, direct and unflinching. "My wet nurse quit. I believe I mentioned that." "You did. I need help, the kind of help you provided today." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Mr. Hartley, I don't think you understand what you're asking." "I'm asking you to keep my son alive," Jackson said, his voice dropping lower. "Because I can't do it alone. And he won't take a bottle. And every wet nurse in 3 counties is either too far away or already employed. And today, you saved him." "Today I helped him," Eleanor corrected. "I know what that means," Jackson interrupted. His voice was rough with something that might have been desperation, or might have been hope, or might have been both. "In case you haven't noticed, I'm desperate. My son hasn't slept more than an hour at a time in days. He's losing weight. And I'm failing him." He stopped, swallowed hard. "So yes, I'm asking, and yes, I can pay you. $30 a month, room and board, separate quarters. You would be caring for my son. That's all." $30 was more than Eleanor had ever made in her life. Seamstresses made $12 a month if they were lucky and worked themselves half to death. The boarding house job her cousin had mentioned paid $8. "I'm not a servant," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" Jackson looked down at his sleeping son, then back up at Eleanor. When he spoke, there was something raw in his expression that he couldn't quite hide. "I'm asking you to keep my boy alive, because he won't take a bottle, and you saved him today. And I need help." He paused and his voice dropped even lower. "How long?" Eleanor asked. "Until I can find another solution. A few weeks, maybe a month. And then you leave if you want to, with references, money, whatever you need." It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. That was what Eleanor told herself as she stood there on the boardwalk with the evening sun painting the mountains orange and purple behind them. "Separate quarters," she repeated. "Yes. And I'm not replacing anyone. I'm helping your son. That's all." "That's all," Jackson agreed. The baby stirred, making a small sound, and Jackson's whole body tensed with instinctive alertness. But the child settled again, face pressed against his father's coat, still asleep. Eleanor made her decision. It wasn't about the money, though the money helped. It wasn't about having nowhere else to go, though that was true. It was about the memory of that baby in her arms, finally peaceful after hours of desperate crying. It was about her body remembering its purpose. It was about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, helping someone else's child might help heal the hole where her own child used to be. 1 month, Eleanor said. After that, we reassess. Jackson nodded, relief flooding his features, though he tried to hide it. I'll have my ranch hand bring you out tomorrow morning. We're at the Hartley Ranch. Anyone in town can give you directions. Tomorrow then, Eleanor said. She picked up her trunk and walked toward the address her cousin had given her, aware that she had just agreed to something that would either save her or ruin her, and completely uncertain which it would be. Behind her, Jackson Hartley stood holding his son, watching her go and feeling for the first time in 8 weeks, like maybe, just maybe, his boy was going to survive. Far ahead in time in the summer heat of 1953, Samuel Hartley paused in his story. His grandson Jack was leaning forward, lemonade-forgotten eyes wide. So that's how she came to the ranch, Jack asked. That's how you got a second mother. Samuel nodded slowly, the rocking chair creaking beneath him. That's how Eleanor Wade came into our lives, he said. My father thought it would be for a month. Eleanor thought she would leave as soon as she found something better. But sometimes God has other ideas, and sometimes a month becomes a lifetime. He looked out over the ranch at the cattle grazing in the distance, at the mountains standing eternal on the horizon. But I'm getting ahead of myself, Samuel said. First, Eleanor had to survive her first week at Hartley Ranch, and that, my boy, is where things got complicated. The ranch hand who arrived at dawn to collect Eleanor spoke exactly 12 words during the entire 15-mile journey. His name was Rex Coleman, a man somewhere between 40 and 60 whose face had been carved by wind and sun into something resembling weathered leather. He loaded Eleanor's trunk onto the wagon without comment, helped her up to the seat with a grunt that might have been greeting or might have been complaint, and set the horses moving before she had fully settled. Ranch is northeast, Rex said, which was 3 words. They rode for 20 minutes in silence. River runs through the property, Rex added, which brought his total to 9. Another 30 minutes passed with only the sound of wheels on dirt road and the occasional protest from the horses. Boss said you'd stay in the cabin, Rex concluded as they crested a hill and the Hartley Ranch came into view below them. 12 words total. Rex clearly believed in economy of speech. But Eleanor forgot about Rex's silence the moment she saw the ranch. The main house was stone and timber, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The roof was shake shingle, well-maintained, and the windows caught the morning light like they were showing off. It was the kind of house that spoke of permanence, of someone who had put down roots and intended to stay. Beyond the house stretched a collection of buildings that turned the property into something resembling a small town. Bunkhouses for the ranch hands, long and low, with smoke rising from their chimneys. Barns big enough to hold hay and equipment and entire herds if the weather turned bad. Stables where horses moved like liquid muscle, their coats gleaming in the early sun. A smokehouse, storage sheds, corrals where cattle waited patiently for whatever came next. And in the distance, as far as Eleanor could see, land rolled out in waves of grass and occasional trees bordered by the mountains that rose like walls at the edge of the world. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight. It was also intimidating as hell. Rex drove the wagon past the main house to a small cabin set back about 50 yards. It was simple, 1 room with a stone chimney and 2 windows. Nothing fancy, but it was clean and it was private and it was more space than Eleanor had called her own in years. Boss said you'd stay here, Rex repeated, apparently deciding this warranted saying twice. He set her trunk down just inside the door. Main house is that way. Kitchen's always got coffee on. Then he left, and Eleanor was alone. The cabin was spare but not uncomfortable. A bed with a quilt that looked handmade, the stitching careful and even. Someone had taken time with that quilt, had put thought into the pattern. A small table and single chair sat beneath one window. A washstand held a pitcher and basin, both clean. A stove squatted in one corner, already laid with kindling, ready to be lit when needed. Eleanor unpacked slowly, hanging her 3 dresses on pegs driven into the wall. She set her sewing kit on the table, placed her Bible beside it. Then she opened the wooden box from her trunk, one she never opened, and looked inside at the tiny gown she had made for Martha. White cotton with careful embroidery at the collar, work she had done by candlelight in those hopeful months before the birth. She touched it once very lightly, feeling the softness of the fabric and the weight of all the dreams that had died with her daughter. Then she closed the box and pushed it under the bed. Some grief you carried with you always. but some grief you had to set down even temporarily or it would crush you flat. And Eleanor needed to be able to stand upright if she was going to survive here. She washed her face in the basin, changed into a fresh dress, and walked toward the main house. She found Jackson in the kitchen, holding the baby and attempting to heat a bottle one-handed while the child fussed against him. The kitchen was large and well-equipped with a cast-iron stove that looked like it cost more than most people made in a year. Copper pots hung from hooks on the wall. A table big enough to seat 8 dominated the center of the room. And everywhere there were signs of a woman's touch. Curtains at the windows, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a sampler on the wall that read, "God bless this home" in careful cross-stitch. "You're burning it," Eleanor said from the doorway. Jackson jumped, nearly dropping both baby and bottle. He spun to face her, startled, and for a moment they both just stood there. Then Eleanor crossed the kitchen and took the bottle from him, dumping the scalded milk and starting over. "The milk," she explained, testing the temperature against her wrist the way her mother had taught her years ago. "You're heating it too fast. It'll scald and hurt his stomach." Jackson watched her work, holding his son, looking like a man who had been caught doing something wrong but wasn't sure what. "He's been fed," Eleanor asked. "I tried a bottle an hour ago. He wouldn't take it." "And before that?" "Last night, when we got to my sister's house, you weren't there, so I tried." Jackson stopped. It didn't go well. The baby was starting to work himself up toward a scream, his little face scrunching, his body tensing. Eleanor tested the milk again, found it acceptable, and held out her arms. "May I?" Jackson handed over his son like he was surrendering something precious to forces beyond his control. Eleanor settled into one of the kitchen chairs, adjusted the baby against her, and offered the bottle. The child turned his head away. She tried again, patient, persistent, but the baby wanted nothing to do with it. "All right then," Eleanor murmured. "We'll do it your way." She set the bottle aside, loosened her bodice with the efficiency of someone who was no longer shy about necessity, and brought the baby to her breast. He latched immediately, and the kitchen filled with the quiet sounds of nursing. Jackson stood by the stove, hands braced against the counter, staring at nothing. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the baby feeding, the clock ticking on the wall, and somewhere outside a horse whinnying in the corral. Finally, Jackson said, "My wife used to sit there." Eleanor looked up at him. "In that chair," Jackson continued. His voice was flat, carefully empty of emotion. "She'd sit there in the mornings and drink coffee and read me letters from her family in Denver. Her father was a banker, important man. Didn't approve of me much, but Catherine didn't care. She chose this life anyway." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the house, at the ranch beyond. "She died in the bedroom upstairs. Doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done, too much bleeding. But I keep thinking if I'd gotten the doctor from Denver instead of Greeley, if I'd had someone better, maybe she'd still be here." His hands curled into fists on the counter. "I don't know what to do with all the things she left behind. Her dresses are still in the wardrobe. Her books are still on the nightstand. There's a sampler she was making with the baby's name on it, except we never decided on a name, so it's just blank where the name should be." "What name had you chosen?" Eleanor asked quietly. Jackson's jaw tightened. "We hadn't decided. She wanted James after her father. I liked Thomas. We kept arguing about it the way married people do. And then there wasn't time to argue anymore." "What do you call him now?" "I don't. I just call him the baby, or son. And I know that's wrong, but I can't name him without her. It wouldn't be right." Eleanor looked down at the child in her arms. He was feeding more slowly now, drowsy and content, his hand resting against her chest. He was a person, this little one, not just a baby, not just a problem to be solved. He was someone who would grow and learn and become, and he deserved to be called by a name. "He needs a name," she said gently. "He's a person, not just a baby. He deserves to be called something." "I know." "Then choose." Jackson looked at her, and something desperate moved behind his eyes. "You choose," he said. Eleanor blinked. "Me? You're keeping him alive. You get to name him." It was absurd. It was inappropriate. Except that Jackson was looking at her like she had already become something more than a hired wet nurse, like she had become essential. And Eleanor felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She thought about it while the baby nursed. about the man who wanted to honor his wife's choice and his own, about a child who deserved both parents in his name, even though one was gone. Samuel James, she said after a moment. Both names, Samuel James Hartley. That way you're both there. Jackson's throat worked. He stared at her, then at his son, then back at her. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. Samuel, he said, testing it, then again firmer. Samuel James Hartley. The baby Samuel had fallen asleep nursing milk, drunk and peaceful. Eleanor looked down at him and thought, I'm in trouble, because she already cared too much about this child who wasn't hers, because she was already thinking of him as Samuel instead of the baby, because her heart was already making connections her mind knew were dangerous. But she didn't say any of that. She just held the sleeping infant and watched Jackson Hartley's face work through emotions he couldn't quite name, and she wondered what she had gotten herself into. Life at the ranch developed a rhythm over the following weeks. Samuel woke every 3 hours, screaming his opinions about the world. Eleanor fed him, changed him, walked him when he was fussy, sang to him when he couldn't sleep. The songs were ones her mother had sung to her, simple melodies about mockingbirds and cradles and sleep that wouldn't come. Jackson hovered nearby during those first days, trying to help and mostly getting in the way. He would hold Samuel while Eleanor prepared herself, then paced the length of the kitchen while she fed him, as if standing still would somehow make the process more difficult. He asked questions that had no answers. Is he getting enough? Is he too warm? Should I call the doctor from Greeley? Eleanor was patient with him, understanding that a man who could command 23 ranch hands and negotiate with territorial officials was completely undone by an 8-pound infant who had no interest in following orders. The first time Samuel spit up all over Jackson's shirt, Eleanor laughed. She immediately tried to stop pressing her hand over her mouth, but the sound escaped anyway. Surprised and genuine, and the first real laughter she had made in months. Jackson looked down at the mess spreading across his chest, soaking through the expensive cotton into his undershirt. This is revenge, isn't it, he said, for not deciding on a name sooner. He's got strong opinions, Eleanor said, still smiling despite herself. Takes after his father. I don't spit on people. No, you just glare until they surrender. Jackson's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. That's efficient communication. Samuel burped loud and satisfied like a tiny drunk man after a good meal. He seemed entirely pleased with himself. Excuse you, Jackson said to his son. The baby stared at him, unblinking and unimpressed, as if to say that manners were irrelevant when one was 3 months old and had just accomplished something important. The days passed, then a week, then 2. Eleanor moved through the house with increasing confidence, learning where things were kept, how the stove worked best, which floorboards creaked. The cabin felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a place where she could breathe. She sewed in the evenings, mending Jackson's shirts because they needed it and because idle hands made her think too much. She hemmed work pants for the ranch hands, who asked politely and paid in small kindnesses, like leaving firewood stacked by her cabin door. She made tiny gowns for Samuel because the ones Jackson had were already too small and the baby was growing despite himself. Jackson worked long days managing the ranch. He rode out to check fence lines with Rex in the other hands. He met with cattle buyers who came from as far as Denver and Cheyenne. He dealt with disputes between men with horses that went lame, with weather that threatened the grass and water that needed to be managed carefully. But he came back to the house at odd times during the day, ostensibly to check on Samuel. Really, Eleanor suspected to check on her, to make sure she hadn't disappeared, hadn't changed her mind, hadn't decided this was too much and she was leaving. He would stand in the doorway of whatever room she was in, watching her with the baby, watching her fold laundry, watching her move through his kitchen like she belonged there. And something in his expression grew complicated, layered with things he didn't say, and maybe didn't understand himself. One Thursday evening, Samuel decided to stage a rebellion against sleep. Eleanor walked him for an hour, humming every song she knew. When that didn't work, she tried rocking, then feeding, then walking again. Nothing helped. Samuel screamed with the conviction of someone who had been deeply wronged and intended to make sure the whole territory heard about it. Jackson appeared in the doorway of the cabin where Eleanor was attempting to pace the child into submission. Give him to me, Jackson said. You need to rest. You have that cattle sale tomorrow, Eleanor protested. You need to sleep. And you've been walking for an hour. Give him to me. Eleanor handed Samuel over, too exhausted to argue. Jackson took his son and walked outside into the cool night air. Eleanor followed, standing on the cabin's small porch, watching as Jackson paced the yard with the baby pressed against his chest. Listen here, Jackson said to Samuel, his voice low but firm. I know life is hard. I know your mother's gone and nothing makes sense, and you're too small to understand any of it. But you need to sleep, and your Eleanor needs to sleep. So we're going to make a deal. You sleep tonight, and tomorrow I'll carry you around the ranch and show you the horses. Does that sound fair? Samuel screamed. I'm going to take that as an agreement, Jackson said. Eleanor watched them, this large, gruff man, trying to negotiate with an infant who couldn't possibly understand him, and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Something warm and terrifying and completely unwanted. She turned and went back inside before she could name it. Summer heat settled over the ranch in August like a living thing, heavy and thick. Work continued because it had to. Cattle still needed tending. Fences still needed mending. But everything moved slower. People took longer breaks in whatever shade they could find. They drank more water. They complained less because complaining required energy nobody had. Eleanor adapted. She learned to nurse Samuel in the early morning and when it was cool to keep the cabin windows open at night for any hint of breeze, to wet cloths and press them to the back of her neck when the heat made her dizzy. Jackson noticed. He started leaving a bucket of cool water outside the cabin door each morning. He never mentioned it, never made it a thing, just left it there like it was normal, like he had always done it. Eleanor noticed. She started leaving extra portions of whatever she cooked on the kitchen table, knowing Jackson often forgot to eat when he was busy with ranch work. Cornbread, stew, biscuits that were never as good as she wanted them to be, but were better than nothing. They moved around each other like dancers learning a choreography neither had chosen. Small kindnesses exchanged without comment. Comfortable silences growing longer. A partnership forming in the spaces between words. It was during one of those blazing afternoons, when everyone else was seeking shade, that Eleanor brought Samuel into the main house to feed him somewhere cooler. Jackson was at the kitchen table going over account books, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair damp with sweat. He looked up when she entered. Stay, he said. It's cooler in here than the cabin. Eleanor settled into the chair across from him. Samuel was already fussing, hungry and hot, and uninterested in patience. She adjusted herself, brought the baby to feed, and within moments the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Samuel nursing and Jackson's pencil scratching across paper. Eleanor watched him work. He had good hands, scarred and calloused, but careful with the pencil. His writing was surprisingly neat for a man who spent most of his time on horseback. Every so often he would frown at a figure, cross something out, recalculate. Are the numbers wrong? Eleanor asked quietly. Jackson glanced up. The numbers are fine, better than fine. We're having the best year I've had since I bought this place 5 years ago. He set the pencil down. But profit doesn't mean much when you can't share it with anyone. The words sat heavy between them. Samuel finished on one side and Eleanor adjusted him to the other. Jackson's eyes dropped to the movement before he caught himself and looked away sharply, his face going carefully blank. You can look, Eleanor said. It's not appropriate. Jackson's jaw tightened. I'm feeding your son in your kitchen. Appropriate stopped it being relevant about 3 weeks ago. That's different. How down? It just is. Eleanor studied him. His shoulders were tense, his hands flat on the table like he was holding himself still by force. There was something in his posture, rigid and controlled and determined, that suggested looking at her right now would be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the propriety. Mr. Hartley, Eleanor began. Jackson, he said. Just Jackson. You're living in my house, nursing my child. I think we're past formality. Jackson, Eleanor corrected. You're allowed to be human. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're allowed to grieve your wife and still notice that there's another woman in your house. Both things can be true. Jackson's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and defensive. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm not accusing you of anything, Eleanor interrupted gently. I'm just saying you don't have to pretend I'm invisible. It must be exhausting. Jackson stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, braced his hands on the frame, stared out at the ranch like the horses and cattle might have answers he needed. My wife has been dead for 3 months, he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw. 3 months and I look at you holding my son, and I feel things I shouldn't feel. It's too soon. It's disrespectful. Feeling isn't disrespectful, Eleanor said. It's human. What I'm feeling isn't appropriate. Eleanor's heart was beating too fast. Samuel had fallen asleep, his small body warm and heavy against her. She adjusted her dress, covering herself, and stood carefully. She crossed the kitchen to stand a few feet behind Jackson, close enough to speak quietly but not so close as to crowd him. "Jackson," she said. He didn't turn around. "Jackson, look at me." Slowly he turned. The expression on his face was raw, unguarded. Grief and guilt and something else, something heated and desperate that made Eleanor's breath catch. "What you're feeling is life," she said carefully. "You're alive and lonely, and there's a woman in your house who isn't your wife, and your body doesn't understand the difference between appropriate and alive." She paused, then said quietly, "Neither does mine." Jackson's breath hitched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The distance between them felt both too much and not enough. Eleanor could feel the heat coming off him, could smell sun and work, and something underneath that was just him. "You should go," Jackson said finally. His voice was strained. "Before I do something we'll both regret." Eleanor nodded. She walked toward the door, Samuel secure in her arms. At the threshold she paused and looked back. Jackson was standing with his hands braced on the table, head down, breathing carefully. "Jackson," she said. He looked up. "It's painful," she said softly, feeling things again. "But I think maybe it means we're still alive. And maybe that's not such a terrible thing." Then she walked out before she could see his reaction, holding herself steady, heart pounding, knowing she had just crossed a line neither of them could uncross. Jackson didn't come to the cabin that night, or the next night. For 3 days he avoided her except when absolutely necessary, passing Samuel between them, with barely a word, leaving money for supplies on the kitchen table instead of asking her directly what was needed. Eleanor told herself it was better this way. Safer. Less complicated. She also hated it. On the 4th day, a man rode up to the ranch. He was well-dressed, riding a fine horse, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from money and education and never having been told no. He asked for Jackson, who emerged from the barn, looking suspicious of strangers bearing business proposals. The man introduced himself as Marcus Ashford, a cattle buyer from Kansas City. He wanted to discuss a deal, railway access through Jackson's property. Significant money involved. The kind of opportunity that could double or triple Jackson's operation. They talked for 2 hours in Jackson's study, while Eleanor stayed in the cabin with Samuel, hearing only fragments of raised voices through the open windows. When Marcus finally left, Jackson came to find her. He looked exhausted, wrung out by negotiation and possibility, and decisions that felt too big. "I need to go to Denver," he said without preamble. "For a week, maybe longer. There are contracts to negotiate, surveyors to meet with, lawyers to argue with." He paused. "I'll leave money for food and the supplies. Rex will check in daily. If you need anything, just tell him." "I'll be fine," Eleanor said. Jackson nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, Samuel sleeping peacefully in the cradle Eleanor had moved in from the main house, and something worked in his face, like he was trying to decide whether to say more. "Will you stay?" he asked finally. "While I'm gone, where would I go?" "You could leave. Take the money I've already paid you. Find work somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't make things so complicated." Eleanor looked down at Samuel, who was awake now, his dark eyes staring at nothing in particular, his small hand opening and closing on some instinct only babies understood. "I'll stay," she said. Relief flooded Jackson's face, quick and undeniable, before he schooled his expression back to something more neutral. "Thank you," he said. He left the next morning before dawn. Eleanor heard the wagon leave, the sound of horses fading into distance, and then the ranch was quiet except for the normal sounds of men working and cattle lowing, and Samuel demanding attention every 3 hours like a very small, very insistent clock. She told herself this was good. Space was necessary. Distance would help clear her head. She almost believed it. Jackson had been gone for 10 days when the letter arrived. Rex brought it up from town along with a delivery of flour and sugar, handing it to Eleanor, with a shrug that said mail was not his concern and he had better things to do. "Mail for you, Miss Eleanor," Rex said, which was actually being verbose for him. "Looks official." The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, the kind people used when they wanted to impress. The return address was Boston, Massachusetts. Eleanor's hands went cold when she saw the handwriting. She knew that handwriting. She carried the letter to the cabin, set Samuel in his cradle, where he was happily trying to eat his own fist, and sat at the small table for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat slanted script she remembered from 12 years of reading letters that said almost coming and soon and just a bit longer. "My dearest Eleanor." It began, and her stomach turned over. "After many delays, business matters, and family obligations that required resolution, I am finally in a position to make good on the promises I made so long ago. I have secured a position at Henderson and Associates, a respected law firm in Denver with an annual salary that will allow us to live comfortably. I will be arriving in Fort Collins in late September to formalize our engagement and arrange our marriage. I know I have asked you to wait far longer than is fair, but I am a man of my word, and I intend to honor the commitment we made when we were young. Prepare yourself for a new life, Eleanor. We will finally be together as we always intended. With deepest affection, Preston Mitchell." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down very carefully and walked outside before the walls could close in on her. 12 years ago, when Eleanor had been 16 and stupid with hope, Preston Mitchell had been 22 and destined for law school in Boston. He had been handsome, educated, confident in the way men from wealthy families were confident, like the world owed them success and happiness and would deliver both on schedule. They had met at a church social in Cleveland, Ohio, where Eleanor had been living with her parents. Preston was visiting relatives. He had noticed her across the room and decided she was the kind of girl who would wait for him while he built his career. He had been right. They had corresponded for years, letters arriving every few months full of excuses and promises. He was finishing school. He was establishing himself. His father was ill. His mother needed him. There were complications with an inheritance, business opportunities he couldn't pass up. Soon, he always said. Soon. Eleanor had waited. She had turned down other suitors, not many but a few. She had kept herself modest, proper, faithful to promises made when she was too young to understand how long 12 years actually was. And then she had met Thomas Wade, a carpenter, quiet and kind. Nothing like Preston. He had asked her to marry him with no promises of wealth or status, just honesty and a life they would build together day by day with their own hands. Eleanor had said yes. She had written to Preston explaining. The letter she received back had been cold, brief, wishing her well in a tone that suggested he had never really intended to come back anyway. She had been married for 3 years, good years, simple and hard, but good. Thomas had made her laugh. He had held her when she cried. He had been there present, real in ways Preston had never been. And then Thomas had died. And then Martha had died. And now Preston Mitchell was coming back 12 years later, ready to claim her like she was property he had stored somewhere and finally gotten around to collecting. Eleanor stood in the yard with the letter crumpled in her fist and felt something hot and sharp building in her chest. Anger. No rage. He thought he could just show up now. After she had waited and grieved and built and lost and survived, after she had become someone completely different from the girl who had promised to wait, the rage burned through her, clean and clarifying, and underneath it was something worse. Fear. Because Preston represented the life she had once wanted, education and culture and respectability. A house in Denver with servants, opera and parties and all the things she had dreamed about at 16. And Jackson represented something else entirely. Something she hadn't known she wanted until it was right in front of her. Something that terrified her precisely because she could already feel herself caring too much. She didn't know which frightened her more, the possibility that Preston would take her away from this, or the possibility that she would want to go. Jackson returned from Denver on a Tuesday afternoon, exhausted and irritated, and ready to complain about lawyers and surveyors and the general incompetence of everyone involved in railway negotiations. He found Eleanor in the main house kitchen, feeding Samuel. Her face was pale and set like stone. "What happened?" Jackson asked, immediately dropping his saddlebags by the door. "Nothing," Eleanor said. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "Nothing happened. Everything's fine." Jackson pulled out a chair and sat across from her, deliberate and stubborn. You're a terrible liar. And you're nosy. It's my house. Then ask your house. Maybe it'll tell you. Jackson leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and waited. It was a technique he used with stubborn cattle and stubborn ranch hands. And apparently it worked on stubborn women too, because after a long moment of silence, Eleanor's rigid posture cracked. I got a letter, she said finally, from someone I used to know. Someone I was supposed to marry 12 years ago, except he decided building a career was more important than keeping promises. She laughed, but it sounded broken sharp at the edges. He's coming to Fort Collins next month. He wants to marry me now. Apparently he's finally ready. Jackson went very still. And nothing. I don't want to marry him. I don't even like him anymore. He's a stranger who thinks I'm still 16 and waiting by a window somewhere pressing flowers and sighing over letters. Then tell him no. I plan to. So what's the problem? Eleanor looked down at Samuel, who had fallen asleep mid-feeding his small face peaceful against her breast. When she spoke, her voice was small and lost. The problem is, I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. I waited 12 years for a man who didn't come. I married someone else and he died. I had a baby and she died. And now I'm here nursing your son, living in your house, and I don't know if I'm here because I want to be or because I have nowhere else to go. Jackson leaned forward, elbows on the table. His voice was quiet but firm. You think I'd let you stay if I thought you were just hiding? I don't know what you'd do. I'd tell you to leave, Jackson said bluntly. If I thought you were here because you had no other choice, I'd give you money and references and tell you to find something better. I don't want someone taking care of my son out of desperation. Then why do you want me here? The question hung in the air, dangerous and necessary. Jackson's jaw worked. He looked at Samuel, then back at Eleanor, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. Because you're good with him. Because he's thriving with you in ways he wasn't before. Because you look at him like he matters, not like he's a burden. He paused, then continued. And because when I came home today, the first thing I wanted to do was find you and tell you about Denver. About the contracts and the railway deal and all of it. And that scared me so much I almost turned the wagon around and left again. Eleanor's breath caught. I'm not asking you to replace my wife, Jackson continued. I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm just asking you to make your decision based on what you actually want, not on what some man from your past thinks he's owed. What if I don't know what I want? Then figure it out, Jackson said, but do it here with time, with honesty. His eyes held hers steady and unflinching. And if you decide you want to leave, I'll help you go. No guilt, no debt. Just be sure. Eleanor looked at him, at this man who had been arrogant and desperate and stubborn and kind, who had handed his son to a stranger because he had been brave enough to admit he couldn't do it alone, who was looking at her now like she was something valuable, not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was. I don't want to marry Preston Mitchell, Eleanor said quietly. Good. But I don't know if I want to stay here either. Fair enough. I need time. You have it. Samuel stirred in her arms, making a small complaining sound without waking. Eleanor adjusted him gently and Jackson watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something soft and complicated and maybe a little bit hopeful. Jackson, she said. Yeah. Thank you for not making this harder than it already is. Jackson stood collecting his saddlebags. At the doorway he paused. For what it's worth, he said, I hope you stay. Then he left before she could respond, and Eleanor sat in the kitchen with Samuel warm in her arms and Preston's letter burning a hole in her pocket and absolutely no idea what she was going to do when September came. Preston Mitchell arrived in Fort Collins 4 weeks later on a Saturday morning when the autumn air had just begun to hint at the winter to come. He sent word to the ranch on Friday afternoon, a telegram delivered by a boy from the telegraph office who rode out specially and expected a tip for his trouble. Arriving Fort Collins Saturday morning. We'll call at ranch to see Eleanor. Expect me at 10 o'clock. Preston Mitchell. Eleanor read the telegram 3 times, her hands steady, even though her heart was racing. Jackson found her on the porch of the cabin, the paper in her lap, staring at nothing. He's coming, she said without preamble. Jackson sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. When, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. They sat in silence for a moment. Samuel was napping inside his small snores audible through the open window. The ranch was quiet in the afternoon heat, most of the hands taking their break before the evening work began. "You don't have to see him," Jackson said finally. "I can send Rex to town. Tell him you're not available." "No," Eleanor's voice was firm. "I need to face this. I need to end it properly. Then he comes here, to you, not the other way around." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, the kind of quiet protectiveness that Jackson did better than anyone Eleanor had ever known. Not controlling, not smothering, just there, solid as the mountains, ready to back her up if she needed it. "All right," Eleanor said. Preston Mitchell arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, which shouldn't have surprised her. Preston had always been punctual. It was one of the few promises he had ever kept. He drove a fine carriage pulled by match bay horses, the kind of equipage that announced money and status before the driver ever opened his mouth. His suit was expensive, tailored perfectly to his frame. His hat was new. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked exactly like what he was, a successful lawyer from Boston who had finally decided to collect on a promise made 12 years ago. Eleanor stood in the yard with Samuel in her arms. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing her best dress, the dark blue one she had made herself. Her hair was pinned up properly. She looked respectable, which was important. She wanted Preston to see exactly what he was losing. Jackson stood on the porch of the main house, arms crossed, watching. He hadn't said he would be there, but Eleanor had known he would be. Rex was somewhere nearby too, she noticed. And a few of the other ranch hands had found reasons to be working within earshot. Preston climbed down from the carriage, removed his hat, and smiled. It was the same smile she remembered from 12 years ago. Confident, charming, practiced. "Eleanor," he said, crossing the yard toward her. "It's been far too long." "Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor replied, her voice cool and formal. Preston's smile faltered slightly. "Please call me Preston. We're practically engaged." "No," Eleanor said clearly, "we're not." Preston stopped a few feet away from her. His eyes took in Samuel, the cabin behind her, Jackson, watching from the porch. She could see him trying to understand the situation, trying to fit it into whatever picture he had built in his mind. "I received your letter," Eleanor continued before he could speak. "I appreciate you taking the time to write, but my answer is no." Preston blinked. "Eleanor, be reasonable. I've come all this way." "Nobody asked you to. We had an understanding." "We had letters," Eleanor corrected. 12 years of letters where you explained why you couldn't come. And now you're here and I'm telling you it's too late." Preston's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something harder. He gestured at Samuel. "Is that child yours?" "None of your business." "Eleanor, look at yourself." His voice took on a pitying tone that made her want to slap him. "You're working as a wet nurse on a cattle ranch. I can offer you so much more. I have a position with Henderson and Associates in Denver. $2,500 annually, a house on Capitol Hill. You'll have servants, culture, society, everything we talked about when we were young." He pulled photographs from his coat pocket, showing her images of a fine house, an office with his name on the door. "This could be yours," Preston said. "This could be our life. I don't want that life anymore." "Because of him," Preston gestured toward Jackson, his voice rising. "Because of some rancher who has you working like a common servant." Eleanor felt anger flash hot and clean through her chest. "Because of me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I'm not the 16-year-old girl who waited by windows anymore. I'm a widow. I buried a husband and a daughter. I survived things you can't begin to imagine. And I'm not interested in being claimed like forgotten property you finally got around to collecting." Preston's face flushed red. "I came all this way. You came 12 years too late. I had obligations, family matters, business that required attention." "So did I," Eleanor said, "to myself, to living my life, to not waiting forever for someone who was never really going to come." She took a step closer to him, Samuel secure in her arms. "Go back to Boston, Preston. Find someone who still believes in the version of yourself you're selling. Find someone who hasn't learned that words without action are just noise. I did believe in you once. You killed that girl when you didn't show up. And I'm not her anymore." She turned and walked toward the house Samuel pressed against her shoulder. She didn't look back, didn't give Preston the satisfaction of seeing if his words had landed. She just walked steady and sure toward the porch where Jackson waited. Behind her, she heard Preston sputter. "Who are you to her?" Jackson's voice was flat, dangerous in its calm. "I'm the man who lives here, and you're trespassing. This is absurd. She's being unreasonable." "The lady made herself clear," Jackson said, "and unless you want to discuss property law with someone who's significantly less polite than she was, I suggest you leave, now." Eleanor climbed the porch steps and went inside without looking back. Through the window, she watched Preston stand in the yard for another moment, his face working through anger and disbelief. Then he climbed back into his carriage and drove away, the matched bays kicking up dust as they left. Rex appeared from wherever he had been lurking, looking disappointed that he hadn't gotten to physically remove anyone from the property. Jackson came inside a few minutes later. Eleanor was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, Samuel in her lap. Her hands were shaking now that it was over. The rush of anger and certainty had faded, leaving her hollow and uncertain. "He's gone," Jackson said. "Good. You all right?" Eleanor looked at him. At this man who had given her space and time and honesty, who had protected her without smothering her, who had made her feel valuable without making her feel owned. "I'm staying," she said. Jackson went very still. "What?" "I'm staying. Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because of Samuel or the money or because I'm afraid of being alone." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm staying because I want to. Because this place feels more like home than anywhere I've been in years. Because when I think about leaving, everything in me says no." Jackson crossed the kitchen, slowly stopping close enough that she could see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Close enough that she could see hope and fear warring in his expression. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "I'm not replacing your wife," Eleanor said quickly, needing to say it before he could. "I'm not asking for anything except time, but I'm staying." Jackson reached out carefully like she was something precious and breakable, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately gently, not in the practical exchange of caring for Samuel, but in a way that was just about them. The tenderness of it made Eleanor's throat close. "I want you to stay," Jackson said quietly. "Not for Samuel, for me." The honesty in his voice undid something in Eleanor's chest, some last barrier she had been holding up to protect herself. She stood careful with Samuel still in her arms and let herself lean into Jackson just slightly. Just enough to feel his solidity, his warmth, his there-ness. "Then I'm here," she whispered. They stood in the kitchen like that for a long moment, Samuel between them as he always was, and neither of them moved to close the distance further, but neither of them pulled away either. It was enough for now. It was enough, Brad. October arrived with cooler nights and the first hint of frost on the grass in the mornings. The cattle were moved to winter pastures. The ranch hands started wearing extra layers and complaining about the cold like it was a personal insult, even though they all knew it was nothing compared to what was coming. Samuel was 5 months old now, starting to laugh at things only babies found funny. He could grab things on purpose, could roll himself over, could make sounds that weren't quite words but seemed to carry opinions anyway. He had Jackson's dark hair and what looked like it might become Eleanor's stubbornness, though it was hard to tell at 5 months whether stubbornness was personality or just being a baby. Jackson came to the cabin one evening in mid-October, after the dinner Eleanor had made for him had gone cold on the kitchen table because he had been out dealing with a fence that had come down in the wind. He looked exhausted, covered in dust, his hands scraped from working wire and wood. Eleanor was sewing by lamplight, mending one of his shirts that had torn at the shoulder. Samuel was asleep in his cradle, snoring softly in that way babies did when they were deeply, completely out. "You need to eat," Eleanor said, setting down her sewing. "I need to ask you something first," Jackson replied. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, turning it over and over like a schoolboy working up courage. Eleanor set down the shirt and gave him her full attention. "I've been thinking," Jackson said, "about the railway deal, about expansion. Marcus wants me to come to Kansas City next month for meetings. Could be gone 2 weeks, maybe more." Eleanor nodded, waiting. "I can't do it," Jackson continued. "I can't leave Samuel for that long. Not when he's this small. And I can't ask you to stay here alone managing everything with no certainty about what we're doing or where this is going. He took a breath like a man about to jump off something high. So I need to ask you, with certainty, I need to make it something real instead of something we're both pretending isn't happening. Eleanor's heart started beating faster. She stood slowly crossing the small cabin to stand in front of him. Ask me, she said quietly. Jackson set his hat down on the table. His hands were shaking. I'm not good at this, he warned. I don't have pretty words. I'm not romantic. I'm a rancher who smells like cattle half the time and whose idea of celebration is successful fence repair. I know, Eleanor said. I'm still grieving my wife. I probably will be for years. And I can't promise I'll always know how to make room for both her memory and you. I know that too. And I'm stubborn. I bark orders when I'm stressed. I'm terrible at admitting when I'm wrong. Jackson, Eleanor said gently, get to the point. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his face softened. Marry me, he said. Not because you're convenient. Not because Samuel needs you, though God knows he does. Marry me because I want you here. Because I want to come home to you. Because the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm losing something I can't afford to lose again. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. That's not a very romantic proposal. I told you I'm not good at this. No, Eleanor said softly. It's perfect. It's honest. Jackson's hands curled into fists at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Is that a yes? It's a yes if you understand what you're asking, Eleanor said. I'm not Catherine. I won't be her. I won't replace her. I don't want you to. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to have bad days where I grieve my daughter and my first husband. I might not be good company. Neither will I. And I'm going to argue with you when you're being stubborn. Jackson's mouth twitched almost a smile. You already do that. Eleanor closed the distance between them, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Then yes, she said, I'll just marry you, Jackson Hartley. Jackson's breath left him in a rush. Say it again. Yes, Jackson, I'll marry you. This time Jackson did reach for her, his hands settling on her waist with careful reverence, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. He pulled her close enough that she could feel him trembling. I don't deserve you, he said against her hair. You probably don't, Eleanor agreed and felt him laugh, surprised and genuine. Then his mouth found hers in a kiss that was gentle and desperate and full of all the things they hadn't said and might never say because they were both the kind of people who showed love through action rather than words. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. When, he asked. Soon, Eleanor said, before winter sets in, before you change your mind. I'm not going to change my mind. Good, neither am I. Behind them, Samuel stirred in his cradle, made a small complaining sound, and went back to sleep. They stood together in the lamplight, holding each other, and felt the future settle around them like a promise they were both finally ready to keep. They were married in Fort Collins on a cold Thursday in December. The ceremony was held in the small church with the drafty windows and worn pews attended by Jackson's sister Margaret, a handful of ranch hands including Rex and the minister who kept the service brief because he had another wedding scheduled afterward and couldn't afford to run late. Eleanor wore a dress she had made herself, deep blue wool, that was practical but pretty with lace at the collar that she had saved from before. Jackson wore his best suit recently cleaned and held Samuel through the entire ceremony because the baby screamed every time anyone else tried to take him. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Jackson kissed her quick, almost shy aware of witnesses, and the particular awkwardness that came with marrying in front of your ranch hands and sister. Samuel grabbed Eleanor's veil and yanked hard enough to pull several pins loose. He's got opinions about everything, Jackson muttered, trying to untangle tiny fists from fabric. He's your son, Eleanor said, and the word our hung unspoken between them, waiting for the future to make it true. They signed papers in the minister's office, making it legal. Jackson paid the fee, $5 that seemed like nothing for a piece of paper that changed everything. Eleanor signed her name, Eleanor Hartley, for the first time, her hand steady on the pen. Mrs. Hartley. It sounded strange and right and terrifying all at once. They climbed into the wagon and drove back to the ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked like the world was celebrating, even if they were too practical to make a fuss about it. Samuel fell asleep between them, his small body warm and trusting, and Eleanor thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, hollow and grieving, and certain she had nothing left to give. She had been wrong. Winter passed in the way winters did on the frontier, slowly with days that felt endless and nights that came too early. Snow fell heavy in January, piling up against the buildings and making every journey outside a struggle. The cattle huddled together for warmth. The men did the same, crowding into the bunkhouse around the stove, telling stories and playing cards and arguing about things that didn't matter just to pass the time. Eleanor learned the rhythms of being mistress of a ranch house. She learned to cook for 20 men when they all came in hungry from the cold. She learned to manage supplies to make bread in quantities that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, to stretch meals when supplies ran low and the next trip to town was delayed by weather. She learned the business too because Jackson treated her like a partner and not like decoration. He showed her the books, explained the contracts, asked her opinion on deals that Marcus Ashford kept sending from Kansas City. She had a head for numbers, it turned out, could spot inconsistencies and problems that Jackson missed in his focus on the bigger picture. The pasture lease terms don't match the survey boundaries, she pointed out one evening, looking over a contract by lamplight. Jackson looked where she was pointing, frowned, then cursed creatively. I would have signed this, he admitted. That's why you have me, Eleanor said. And it was true. They needed each other in ways that went beyond what either had expected. Jackson taught her about cattle and grass and water rights. Eleanor taught him about bookkeeping and contracts and the importance of actually reading what you signed. They built something together in those winter months, a partnership that was about more than just caring for Samuel, though he remained at the center of everything. In February, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but hadn't been certain. Her courses had always been irregular, made worse by the grief and stress of the past year. But by mid-February, with the morning sickness making itself known and her body changing in ways she recognized, there was no denying it. She told Jackson over breakfast, matter-of-fact bracing herself for his reaction. Jackson went pale, then very still. Then he stood, walked around the table and pulled her into his arms without a word. You all right? Eleanor asked against his shoulder. Terrified, Jackson admitted. His voice was rough, shaking slightly. But all right. He pulled back his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. Catherine died in childbirth. He said, the words coming out harsh and fast like they hurt to say. And I can't lose you. I can't do that again. You won't, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. I'm healthy. This is different. You can't know that. No, Eleanor agreed. But I can know this. I'm not her. And you're not alone this time. We'll get the doctor from Denver, not Greeley. We'll make sure everything is ready. And I'm going to be fine. Jackson nodded, but she could see the fear in his eyes. The memory of holding Catherine's hand as she died, the terror of history repeating itself. Eleanor took his face in her hands, making him look at her. I'm going to be fine, she repeated firmly, and we're going to have a baby, and Samuel is going to have a brother or sister, and that's a good thing, Jackson. That's life continuing. Life continuing, Jackson repeated, like he was trying to convince himself. Yes. He kissed her, then desperate and grateful and scared, and Eleanor held him tight and promised herself that she would survive this. She had to, because Jackson couldn't lose anyone else, and Samuel needed a mother. And this new baby growing inside her deserved to be born into a world where both parents were there to love them. The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer. Eleanor's body changed, growing round in ways that made her dresses impossible and required new ones that accommodated the expanding reality. Samuel was 10 months old, crawling everywhere, getting into everything, and completely fascinated by the changing shape of Eleanor's stomach. He would pat her belly with his small hands and laugh like it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Jackson was overprotective in ways that ranged from endearing to infuriating. He tried to stop her from lifting laundry baskets. He worried when she spent too long on her feet. He wanted her to rest constantly, as if lying down would somehow guarantee safety. I'm not breakable, Eleanor told him when he tried to take a basket of vegetables from her hands. I know. Then let me work. But what if you strain yourself? What if something happens? Jackson Hartley, Eleanor said, setting the basket down and putting her hands on her hips. If you finish that sentence with one more worry, I'm going to hit you with this basket. Jackson wisely retreated. By August, Eleanor was 7 months along and feeling every day of it. The heat was oppressive. Her back ached constantly. She couldn't sleep properly because the baby seemed to think nighttime was the perfect time for acrobatics. Samuel had started walking, which meant he could now fall down in entirely new and creative ways that gave everyone heart attacks on a regular basis. But despite the discomfort and exhaustion, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She was building a family, not replacing what she had lost, but building something new, something that honored both the past and the future. Catherine's memory lived in Samuel and Jackson's grief in the way they made space for what had been. But Eleanor's presence was building what would be. It felt right. The labor started on a September morning 3 weeks earlier than expected, but not dangerously so. Eleanor woke to cramping pain and the unmistakable sensation that today was the day. She lay still for a moment, breathing through the first contraction, timing it in her head. "Jackson," she said quietly. He was awake instantly, years of light sleeping from ranch work making him alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. The baby's coming." Jackson was out of bed and halfway dressed before Eleanor could sit up. He sent one of the hands to fetch Isabel Craig, the midwife, who had delivered half the babies in the county and had a reputation for being stern and competent and not tolerating nonsense from anyone, including babies who didn't want to be born. Eleanor labored through the morning. The contractions came regular and strong, building in intensity as the hours passed. Jackson stayed with her, holding her hand, letting her squeeze hard enough to leave bruises when the pain peaked. Isabel arrived and took command of the bedroom with the efficiency of a general directing troops. "First babies take time," Isabel announced. "Second ones come faster. This one will be quick." She was right. By early afternoon, Eleanor was pushing, feeling like she was being split in half, screaming through contractions, because there was no point in being quiet about pain this intense. "Again," Isabel commanded. "Push!" Eleanor pushed, gripping Jackson's hand hard enough that she could feel his bones grind together. "Good," Isabel said. "Again, harder." Eleanor pushed harder, her whole body straining with effort. "Once more. Give me everything you've got." Eleanor gave everything, screaming through it, and suddenly there was release and relief in the sound of a baby crying loud and furious and wonderfully perfectly alive. "Girl," Isabel announced, holding up the baby. "Healthy. Good strong lungs on this one." Then Isabel's face changed, professional concern replacing satisfaction. "Towels," she said sharply. "More towels. Now." Jackson looked down and went white. There was too much blood. Too much, too fast, soaking through the sheets, pooling on the mattress. Eleanor could see his face, see him remembering. Catherine see him starting to panic. "Get out," Isabel snapped at Jackson. "You're in the way." "I'm not leaving her," Jackson said, his voice raw. "Then sit down and shut up," Isabel commanded. She was working fast, her hands competent and sure, but Eleanor could see the worry in her eyes. Eleanor felt herself graying out, consciousness getting fuzzy at the edges. She could hear Jackson saying her name, hear the baby crying, hear Isabel muttering instructions to herself as she worked. "Stay with me, Eleanor," Isabel said firmly. "Look at me. Stay with me." "Oh yeah." Eleanor tried to focus, tried to hold on. She thought about Samuel, about how he needed her, about Jackson, about how she had promised not to leave him like Catherine had, about the baby crying, this new little girl who deserved to know her mother. "I'm here," Eleanor managed to say, though her voice sounded far away. "I'm staying." Isabel did something Eleanor wasn't sure what, some medical intervention that hurt like fire but worked. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. "There," Isabel said, sitting back. "There, you're all right now." She cleaned the baby quickly, wrapped her in a blanket, and placed her in Eleanor's arms. "Girl," Isabel repeated. "Healthy, and you scared the hell out of me, but you're going to be fine. But next week we're getting you to a doctor in Fort Collins for a proper check." No arguments. Eleanor looked down at her daughter. The baby had stopped crying and was staring at nothing in particular, her small face scrunched and red. She was perfect. Absolutely, completely perfect. Jackson was collapsed in a chair beside the bed, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking, not quite crying, but close. Eleanor reached out with her free hand and touched his head. "I'm here," she said again. "I'm all right, we're all right." Jackson looked up, his face devastated with relief. He took Eleanor's hand and pressed it to his cheek, and she could feel wetness there, tears he couldn't quite control. "Don't ever do that to me again," he said roughly. I'll try not to, Eleanor promised. She looked down at the baby in her arms. Catherine Grace Hartley, she said. Kate for short. Jackson's throat worked. You'd name her Catherine? She was Samuel's mother. She deserves to be remembered. And Grace, because surviving what we just survived feels like grace. Jackson leaned forward and kissed Eleanor's forehead, gentle and reverent. Then he looked at his daughter. Hello, Kate, he said softly. Welcome to the world. Try not to scare us like that again. Kate yawned, unimpressed by the drama, and went to sleep. Samuel was brought in to meet his sister under careful supervision. He stared at the baby with deep suspicion, like she was a problem that had suddenly appeared and required solving. Baby, he said, which was one of his favorite words lately. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. Your sister. Samuel's face scrunched in thought. Then he delivered his verdict. No. Sorry, son, Jackson said, trying not to laugh. You're outvoted. She's staying. Samuel crossed his arms, a gesture he had learned from watching Jackson, and clearly began planning his resistance to this new development. Kate, oblivious to her brother's rejection, slept peacefully. The years passed the way years do, marked by seasons and small milestones, and the steady accumulation of ordinary days that became a life. The ranch prospered under Jackson and Eleanor's joint management. The railway deal that Marcus had negotiated brought steady income and new opportunities. They expanded carefully, buying adjacent land when it became available, increasing the herd to 1,200 head, hiring more men as the operation grew. Eleanor managed the books with the same precision she brought to sewing, every number in its place, every column balanced. She caught fraud attempts from would-be business partners, spotted inconsistencies in contracts, and earned a reputation as someone you didn't try to cheat because she would catch you and she wouldn't be polite about it. Samuel grew tall and serious, taking after both his fathers in different ways. From Jackson, he got stubbornness and a sense of responsibility that sat heavy on young shoulders. From Thomas, whose name Eleanor told him, when he was old enough to understand, he got a love of building things with his hands and fixing what was broken. Kate was quieter than her brother, but twice as determined. She learned to read early, consuming books like food. By age 7, she had announced she wanted to be either a teacher or a lawyer. She hadn't decided yet. Why not both, Eleanor had suggested. Kate considered this seriously. That's practical. In 1887, when Samuel was 4 and Kate was 2, Eleanor gave birth to a second daughter. Grace Isabel Hartley arrived during a snowstorm, howling her displeasure at the coal world from her first breath. She's got lungs, Isabel Craig said approvingly. This one's going to be loud. She was right. Grace was the wild one, climbing trees as soon as she could walk, catching snakes, coming home covered in mud, and completely unrepentant. She rode horses like she'd been born on one and had no fear of anything, which kept Jackson and Eleanor in a constant state of low-level panic. She's going to give us gray hair, Jackson muttered, watching his youngest daughter scale the barn roof because she had decided the view would be better from up there. You already have gray hair, Eleanor pointed out. She's making it worse. But he said it with affection, with pride, with the particular exhaustion that came from loving children who were determined to live loudly and fully and without caution. The family grew into itself, finding rhythms and traditions. Sunday dinners where everyone gathered, even the ranch hands who wanted to join. Evening stories where Jackson would tell the children about their grandmother Catherine, keeping her memory alive. Samuel teaching Kate to build things, Kate teaching Grace to read. Grace teaching everyone that rules were really more like suggestions. And through it all, Eleanor and Jackson built something that neither could have imagined on that stagecoach in 1883. A partnership, a family, a life. On a summer evening in 1893, 10 years after that stagecoach journey, the family gathered for dinner at the big table in the main house. Jackson sat at the head, Eleanor at the foot, Samuel and Kate and Grace between them. The windows were open to catch the evening breeze. The lamps were lit against the gathering dusk. They were eating roast beef and potatoes and vegetables from the garden Eleanor had insisted on planting 5 years ago, despite Jackson's protest that ranchers didn't need gardens. The conversation was loud and chaotic, the way it always was with 3 children under 10 at the table. Samuel, now 9 years old and taking himself very seriously, set down his fork. "Papa," he said, "at school today, Billy Henderson asked me who my real mother is." The table went silent. Kate and Grace stopped their argument about whose turn it was to clear plates. Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her glass. Jackson's fork paused in midair. Samuel continued, his voice matter-of-fact in the way children could be when they didn't understand they were saying something significant. I told him I have two mothers, one who gave me life and one who gave me everything else. Jackson set down his fork carefully. What did Billy say? He said I was lucky. Samuel smiled, a small, genuine expression of pride. I told him I know. Eleanor felt tears start, hot and unexpected. She fought them, not wanting to cry in front of the children, but they came anyway, streaming down her face. Samuel's expression shifted to worry. Mama Eleanor, are you sad? No, sweet boy, Eleanor managed. I'm happy. She reached across the table, taking Samuel's hand. Your mama, Catherine, would have loved you so much, she said. She wanted you more than anything. She would be so proud of the boy you're becoming. Samuel thought about this, processing it with the seriousness he brought to everything. She does love me, he said finally. You told me she's watching from heaven, so I have three mothers, really. He pointed up, then at Eleanor, then made a circular gesture encompassing the ranch. Mama Catherine in heaven, Mama Eleanor here, and the ranch that keeps us all alive. Everyone laughed, surprised and moved and amazed by a 9-year-old's ability to make complicated things simple. That's a lot of mothers, Kate observed practically. I want 3 mothers too, Grace announced, not wanting to be left out. You have 2, Kate told her. That's enough. Not fair. The moment of emotional weight passed into ordinary sibling squabbling, but something had shifted. Some understanding had settled over the table like a blessing. Jackson stood and walked to Samuel, resting his large hand on his son's head. You're a smart boy, Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. A kind boy. Both your mothers would be proud. Eleanor joined them, putting her hand over Jackson's on Samuel's head. Kate and Grace piled in, not fully understanding, but knowing this was important. They stood there, all 5 of them, a tangle of family that had been built on loss and survival, and the unthinkable act of kindness a stranger had offered on a stagecoach 10 years ago. Are we always going to be this weird? Samuel asked, his voice muffled in the group embrace. Probably, Jackson said. Definitely, Eleanor agreed. I like our weird, Kate said. Can we have cake now? Grace wanted to know. Everyone laughed, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary chaos of family life. But as Eleanor looked around the table later, watching Jackson help Grace with her dessert, while Samuel explained something to Kate, with great seriousness, she felt something settle in her chest. Peace. She had lost so much. Thomas and Martha would always be part of her, always be mourned. Catherine would always be part of this family, always be honored. But loss hadn't been the end. It had been a doorway to something else. Something built on honesty and partnership, and children who knew they were loved by mothers who had chosen them as much as blood had chosen them. The summer heat of 1953 pressed down on the Wyoming ranch like a familiar weight. Samuel Hartley, 70 years old now, paused in his rocking chair to take a sip of the lemonade that had gone warm in his glass. His grandson Jack sat forward, eyes wide, completely absorbed. So that's how you got 2 mothers? Jack asked. Because Grandma Eleanor nursed you on the stagecoach. That's how it started, Samuel agreed. But it became more than that. She stayed. She chose to stay. And then she became my mother, not because she had to, but because we became family. He looked out over the ranch, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, at the mountains standing eternal on the horizon. Your great-grandmother Catherine gave me life, Samuel said quietly. She wanted me so much, loved me before I was born, died so I could live. And Grandma Eleanor gave me everything else. Raised me, taught me, loved me like I was hers, even though I wasn't. He turned to Jack, wanting the boy to understand. Family isn't just about blood, son. Family is about who shows up, who stays when things get hard, who chooses you every single day, even when they don't have to. Like Grandma Eleanor chose you, Jack said. Like Grandma Eleanor chose all of us. Samuel stood, his joints protesting the movement in the way old joints did. He walked to the porch railing, Jack following. You see this ranch? Samuel gestured at the land stretching out before them. 5,000 acres, 2,000 head of cattle, 25 men working. Your father will run it someday, and after him, maybe you. He put his hand on Jack's shoulder. But none of this would exist if a woman named Eleanor Wade hadn't done an unthinkable thing on a stagecoach in 1883. If she hadn't been brave enough to offer help to a starving baby. If she hadn't chosen to stay when she could have left. Jack nodded slowly, understanding, settling over his young face. So when Billy Henderson tells you that you can't have two grandmothers, Samuel said, you tell him he's wrong. You tell him some people are lucky enough to have three. And you tell him that family is built by the people who show up and stay, not just by the people who give you your name. Yes, sir, Jack said. They stood together on the porch, three generations of Hartley men, looking out over the land that had been built on loss and survival, and one woman's unthinkable act of compassion 70 years ago. In the distance, the mountains stood unchanging. The cattle grazed, the ranch hands worked, and the legacy of two mothers who had loved one boy continued in the children and grandchildren who carried both their names forward. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, faded and creased from years of handling. It showed a young woman in a plain dress holding an infant sitting in what looked like a stagecoach. The woman's face held a mixture of grief and hope, and she was looking down at the baby with an expression of tender care. This, Samuel said, handing the photograph to Jack, is the moment everything changed. That's me screaming my head off, and that's your great-grandmother, Eleanor, saving my life. Jack held the photograph, carefully studying it. She looks sad, he observed. She was, Samuel agreed. She had lost her own baby just months before, but she chose to help anyway. That's what love does. It shows up even when it hurts. He took the photograph back, tucking it safely in his pocket, again over his heart, where he had carried it for years. Now, Samuel said, settling back into his rocking chair with a satisfied sigh, I believe your grandmother has pie cooling in the kitchen. Why don't you go see if she needs any help with dinner? Jack ran off, young and energetic in the way only 12-year-olds could be. Samuel watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the ranch, to the empire built on one woman's compassion and one man's desperate need in the family they had chosen to become. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully. The ranch hands were heading in from their day's work. And Samuel Hartley sat in his rocking chair, 70 years old, and remembered the two women who had made him possible, one who had given him life, and one who had given him everything else. Both of them mothers. Both of them loved. Both of them remembered. The rocking chair creaked rhythmically as the sun dropped lower, and Samuel closed his eyes and gave thanks for unthinkable acts of kindness that changed the world one screaming baby at a time.